Hello and welcome. Let's take a look at our top story. After a long flight to the United States, Kenya's President William Ruto is down to business. He is set to meet with US President Joe Biden on Wednesday, with talks focusing on debt relief for the East African country. But back home, the Kenyan president is already facing outrage. This is over his luxury charter plane for his trip to the US. The price of hiring the luxury private jet in which Ruto and his delegation travelled is estimated to be $1.5 million. More than 30 people, including a popular comedian, are reported to be accompanying the president. Now, the chartered aircraft used by William Ruto is from Dubai-owned Royal Jet Company. It is not clear why the president opted for the private jet, but there have been safety concerns about the usual presidential plane, Harambee 1, which was bought nearly 30 years ago. Outrage against Ruto for using a luxury jet comes amid growing dissent over plans by the government to impose additional taxes. The government seeks to raise an additional $2.4 billion in taxes in the coming financial year. But critics say the taxes are only being used to fund extravagance of the government. People in Kenya have been facing a worsening cost of living crisis. Last October, the government suspended non-essential foreign travel in a move aimed at curbing runaway public spending. All ministries and state departments were also directed to reduce their operational budgets by 10%. William Ruto's visit is the first state visit by a Kenyan president to the US in 2 decades, and a first by an African leader in 16 years. But William Ruto is a frequent traveler. He has made more than 50 visits abroad since he became president in 2022, averaging at over 3 a month. He has faced similar criticism over his trips abroad and the cost associated with his alleged penchant for air travel, which is often contrasted with the tough economic conditions at home. So much so that a local media newspaper also nicknamed him the Flying President. While William Ruto continues to notch up his air miles, the questions that he faces from his citizens are getting tougher. Now, for more on this, we're being joined by Patrick Bond, who is a political economist live from Johannesburg, South Africa. Hello to you, Patrick. Thank you for being with us on the show.
Oh, it's great to be with you. Thanks.
Now, some Kenyans have expressed outrage that Ruto had chartered an aircraft from the Dubai-owned Royal Jet Company for this trip instead of using his usual presidential plane, given his government's austerity measures and the cost of living crisis. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, and you could even add, Alyson, that Ruto has a very interesting ideological orientation, which he calls hustling, which is a sort of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, entrepreneurship, and very energetic way of addressing his citizenry. And it's not uncommon. We've seen conservative populists move forward in many different locations, but often when they come to power, they are unveiled as part of an elite. And this is just one instance of that has caused some anger in Kenya at a time. The International Monetary Fund is clamping down, a debt crisis on the order of neighboring Ethiopia's, which defaulted 5 months ago, and the controversies especially over whether Kenya, partly under Ruto's rule, but he was also the deputy president, whether they borrowed too much, especially from China, for one project in particular, the big train line that goes from Mombasa, the port, to the capital of Nairobi. And it's a time when there's a lot of geopolitical tension, the terrain in the Horn of Africa, the terrible droughts, and then a flood this month that killed more than 200, make everyone, I'm sure, as angry at any ostentatiousness. And of course, Ruto is going to reply, well, it's worth it. What we're going to do in the next few days is get some debt relief. We'll have to see if that happens.
Yeah. Right. Now, like we mentioned, William Ruto has faced criticism time and again for his penchant for air travel and for costs associated with it. Ironically, he is visiting the US to hold talks on debt relief for Kenya. While this is a historic visit, since it is the first state visit by a Kenyan president to the US in 2 decades, how could this impact William Ruto's popularity back home?
If he does come back with major concessions, probably mostly from the Bretton Woods institutions, one of which has a new president, A.J. Banga, less than a year in the job, who would very much like to appear to be an ally of the Kenyan people. But on the other hand, Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, has also been clamping down, especially on African countries that during the booming 2010s, and especially with the commodity price increase in 22, that meant, let's say, an excessive debt load. I mean, obviously, COVID created enormous pressures that required debt. And the initial debt relief from the G20 wore off. And it's now time, I think, for everyone to get together. And the dilemma is that China, which has about 17% of the debt owed to it from Kenya, hasn't yet really come to the table. Now, their loans are usually higher interest than the multilateral development banks. Sometimes you can, especially if you're a relatively poor country, you can get quite good discounts. And I think that's going to be one of the questions. Did the loans that especially require, as I say, 17% of the foreign debt to China come with conditions such as control of the Mombasa port as collateral? We don't know any final details, but there have been rumors. So I would wait for a full debt package to come together. And maybe in the next couple of days, in meetings at the World Bank and IMF, Ruto will be able to get some debt relief. It's a very strategic country at this point, being very much in Israel's camp against Palestine, very much on the edge of whether to join the BRICS. So this geopolitical positioning is probably one of the crucial factors as to whether Ruto is going to pull some debt relief home.
Right. Now you've just touched on my next question. Coming to his big meeting with President Joe Biden, what are some of the strategic geopolitical interests for both Kenya and the US? And how might this visit strengthen their diplomatic relations?
I think if I'm sitting in Washington, where I used to live for a little while, I'd be thinking about losing West Africa to coups and a democratic election in Senegal. And I'd be thinking, are we going to lose Kenya in the same way? It was always an AFRICOM, the Africa Command Pentagon ally, and also with that very important Indian Ocean connection, crucial for all of the naval activities that, of course, include now the war against the Houthis. And also, if I'm in Washington, I really don't want to see yet more African countries join the BRICS, and that would include not just Egypt and neighboring Ethiopia that joined last August here in Johannesburg, but potentially Algeria, Senegal, Nigeria, the biggest, most populous country, and then Kenya would be very much on that agenda to bring into BRICS. So I think if I were Joe Biden, this would be a very high priority visit, and to have a state visit, as you say, one of the first for a Kenyan. Last year, Cyril Ramaphosa got the state visit, and that's another terrain of competition. The South African president basically looking to be amongst the English-speaking leaders in Africa. Now, if I'm on the other side in Beijing, then I'd say, well, we really want to start offering much more to Kenya to show that balance. And this is a very tense time, particularly because geopolitical terrain is so full, let's say, a minefield, and to tiptoe through it, I'm not sure Joe Biden puts as much of a priority as one of his predecessors, Barack Obama, who had a Kenyan father, and certainly more than Donald Trump, who had terrible words to say about African countries. But I think it'll be a very interesting outcome to see whether for the BRICS meeting in October, Kenya becomes one of the new or observers, or maybe visitors, or maybe even invited to become a new member. And that remains to be seen. But the conditions are a tug of war, and maybe the Kenyan people will benefit if that includes some concessions.
Yeah. Patrick, thank you very much for being with us on Firstpost Africa and for your analysis there.
Thanks, Alyson.
Firstpost reports from the world's second largest continent. Hello, I'm Alyson Grange. A very warm welcome from Durban, South Africa. We get you the news and the newsmakers from Africa. South Africa goes to the polls on the 29th of May. I will track the election and bring you ground reports. Is it the end of the road for the African National Congress? And will former President Jacob Zuma stage a dramatic comeback? From elections to climate change to innovations and opportunities. As the world's attention shifts, we report from Africa, the heart of the global south. Join me every weekday live on Firstpost.